And with this one, I was actually pleasantly surprised. So I'll dissect it in two parts. First of all, privacy won the argument, and then the problem why we're still losing. Quick background on this logo you see up there. NOIP, what is this organization? Who are we? We're basically a European nonprofit. We're based in Vienna. We do, as mentioned before, strategic litigation. We're kind of funded by about 5,500 supporting members, so rather independent, and about 25 people that work with us. That's like lawyers, technicians, NPR, and admin, and so on. And we basically do strategic litigation. So if big tech, Google, Facebook, whatever, is just like, yeah, whatever, fuck the GDPR, we'll just do it anyways. That's usually where we try to step in and say, guys, there is some limits. The biggest fine I think we triggered so far was 1.2 billion, but I'll also tell you in a second that that was never paid. So some of these numbers look impressive, but then you also have to see how much they actually worked in practice. Now, because the headline I was asked to talk about was like, we won the argument, I was like, did we? And checked out some statistics the last days in preparation. And for example, the European Commission actually had a statistic that about 92% of the people think that privacy and security is important. Kind of a bit of a duh anyways. But still in public discussion, it's a question of like, do we really need that? Do people actually care about it? Most people don't really are obsessed with it every day, so therefore privacy must not be a big thing. We kind of also not just won the argument in the public, we generally, as mentioned on the panel before, we also in Europe have this fundamental right to privacy. So it's not just that we have some law, like a consumer law or something else. It's actually in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is kind of our European human rights bill, so to say. We cannot call it a constitution, we call it a treaty, but basically it's the function of that. And there is Article 7, this right to privacy, which is rather broad, and then there is this right to data protection, which is a bit more narrow. Both of them are quite interesting because they can overrule other laws as well. So if there is something that some legislator passes that goes a bit too far, then theoretically the courts can overturn that and say there is a limit on how far you can go here. And that did happen. You can think, for example, of data retention, where they kept all the phone records of everybody for up to 2 years to kind of then figure out if you were involved in terrorism, and it basically didn't yield much, and the Court of Justice overturned that. Now, on the privacy side, traditionally, we're actually quite good. So if we look at, for example, the GDPR, when the European Parliament had to vote on it, that was the voting result on the GDPR. So basically, more than 90% were like, yay, we need these privacy laws, hooray, hooray, let's do this. Oftentimes, the argument is that that's the crazy Europeans. They're like obsessed with these things, but the rest of the world doesn't give a fuck anyways. This is the surveys in the US of how many people want to have a proper privacy law, which doesn't exist there. So even in countries that traditionally were told, you know, they wouldn't care and that's totally different, actually even in these countries there is strong support. Honestly, oftentimes when I speak in the US or talk to US colleagues, they oftentimes know about the consequences of not having privacy much more than the Europeans, because usually, other than I think in Germany, most people don't know that credit ranking is a thing or so, or you can actually get denied a credit card because of some random number. We just run a case like that in Austria, and we just have to educate people that this even exists, because that just generally isn't a thing back home. But if we look at this global trend of do we need that or do we want that, this is globally all the countries that do have some type of like omnibus privacy law. Like not all of them are on the same level, not all of them are perfect, but generally the trend globally is we do protect this. Interestingly, we, however, especially in the European debate, oftentimes look at the US and have this like we versus the US, and if you zoom out on a global stage, you suddenly realize there is one big hole in this, and that's more probably the outlier than the European approach. Now, the other question, if we say people are generally convinced, we can say we have these laws and so on, but the other argument that comes up tons in debates is usually no one cares about the GDPR. That's especially in like more expert fields. People are like, no one actually reads the privacy policy. No one, you know, knows what these laws actually say. And I think that's perfectly fine. I think one big problem that lawyers have is that everybody thinks they need to care about their subject matter, and it's a bit like, you know, if you're techie on one thing, most of the other people do not care about your subject matter, and that's okay because people are experts in their field, and that's fine. If we think about the European Union, we have about, if my clicker works, I hope, yes, we have about 1,200 regulations they pass per year. Tons of regulations on everything. And I was actually flying here. And I did not care about Regulation 923/2021, but probably my flight today cared, because that apparently regulates standardization of European air traffic rules. We all use this stuff every day without giving a fuck, and that's perfectly fine. I think in a developed society, we don't have to care about these regulations. Someone in the background takes care, and then we can benefit from it. If anybody took the train, there is a wonderful regulation 2023 on 1695, whatever that is. That apparently regulates how trains all over Europe communicate with the infrastructure, and that's the reason why any trains actually run. But all of that happens in the background, and we don't care about it, and we probably have never heard about it. We all sit in a building here, and there is a Bauordnung for Berlin that regulates how this building was probably renovated and done, and we can just sit here and feel like probably if there's some fire, we're not going to burn. There's probably someone that took care that we can get out of this. And I think that's important about this question of, do we care about privacy all too much? Most people do not care. They usually, as in anything else, they usually care once there's a problem. We all didn't care about airline safety or like airplane safety rules until suddenly doors were flying out of Boeing planes, and everybody was like, what the fuck is going on there? And then we suddenly realized that the federal government in the US outsourced security to Boeing itself, and we're like, oh, that's a bit weird. But no one before ever being on a plane has ever thought about any of this. And that's fine. I think that is important, that unless you're in this expert field, maybe it's fine that we do not care about it all too much. On the privacy side, what's interesting is there's basically two touch points that people have. One is the banners, and the other one is the privacy policy. And that usually also comes up on like no one cares about any of it, because we're confronted with this shit, which basically is designed. There's what the industry calls consent optimization. That's the wording for, let's make a banner so shitty that everybody just clicks on yes in the end. We call it dark patterns. The industry calls it consent optimization. And under that, you find exact guidelines of how you make an interaction so bumfuck shitty that no one ever is going to interact with it anymore. And interestingly, they managed to blame that on the law and on the privacy people and so on. Right now, the European Commission proposed to get rid of all the cookie banners and actually have a digital signal in the background so that your browser just tells them yes or no, which would be kind of what we do with, for example, language settings. You just put your language to either German and English, and then the website automatically sends me that page back because my browser is signaling that. Super old technology from the 90s. That was proposed to do. Guess who was against it? Google, the German government, the French government, and so on. And we were surprised about it because everybody's like, we hate regulation, we need to simplify, let's get rid of all of this. And the cookie banner is usually the kind of poster child of this. But once there would be a signal where people could actually say no effectively, they know that their consent rates would probably go to 0, and then you wouldn't be able to track anybody online anymore. So suddenly we're absolutely against digitalization and automation because people could actually say no. Same thing with the privacy policy. That's usually also one of these instruments that oftentimes is brought up to say, no one ever reads the privacy policy, no one therefore cares for privacy. We just did a class action in Austria, and I think of about the 3,000 more people that joined, about 50 read the privacy policy, and I think 49 of these visits were probably from our team to check if something is correct in the privacy policy. No one reads that, and that's perfectly fine. It's a bit like the fine print in terms and conditions. We know that no one reads that, but that does not indicate that people don't care about it. If the terms and conditions say you can actually never get your money back, then you do care about it even though you haven't really read it. So there's a lot of these arguments, and some of the other arguments that are around is usually in the US setting more than the European setting is we need to educate everybody more, everybody has to care about it and understand it fully. But the problem is we have litigated, I think, Meta for 15 years by now. I cannot explain to you how Meta fully works. And I think most engineers there cannot fully understand it because it's so vast that even an engineer works on one little bit and not on the whole thing. So this idea of educating people and thereby be able to get full control over it is also rather unrealistic. It's like, you know, high-speed trains that derail. I'm not going to get an engineer in it and understand how that works and therefore make an informed decision to not get on a high-speed train if it's not fully security approved. I just trust that someone else does that. And that's usually what we do in society, especially in Europe where we have this precautionary system, as they call it, but also in the US usually. Where there is an exemption where the US is much more on this kind of, it's kind of your problem approach is this here. I made it as an example where I was renting a car in LA, and there was this wonderful warning on it, and if you zoom into it, It basically says, and almost any product in California, that this product contains chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer, birth defects, and other reproductive harm. That's the Prop 65 warning. So they basically tell you this could have chemicals you could die from. And that is a notice, as they call it, and then you have the choice. And the choice is you take any of the other cars that have exactly the same sticker on it, or you take the bus that also has the same sticker on it, or you walk. And that is one regulatory approach that we see creeping in here more and more, is what they call notice and choice. And it gets so absurd that they even have the same warning on Disney World. So if you go in California to Disney World, you have this Prop 65. And that is kind of what they did with the privacy policy as well, is to suddenly say this is not an information about what we do, but it is a responsibility shifting tool to basically say, we told you we're going to fuck you over, so therefore it's now your problem and not ours anymore. And this is also absolutely not a new phenomenon. In the US, extremely famous, there was a advertisement run up and down like crazy in the 70s with a Native American that was in reality a Sicilian actor, basically crying over the fact that everybody's like putting all the plastic out there, and the end claim was, people start pollution, people can stop it. Who paid for it? The plastics industry. And that was exactly the same responsibility shifting of, no, it's not our plastic that we produce, it's you not recycling properly. That is actually the problem here. And I was an exchange in Florida, there was no recycling in our district. There was simply no place you could potentially recycle plastics, but the responsibility shifting worked and just said, now it's your problem, not ours. And a lot of the notice and choice approaches we have as well go kind of into this, it's your fault. And it was really interesting because this narrative of it's not us as companies, it's the user doing something wrong, is first of all very prominent in the media. Like I get that in every journalistic interview is like, and in the end, what can users do? And the answer is, unless you're a techie and you're really deep into the weeds, the normal person like my mom or like, the average person somewhere around not into this stuff too much cannot do much and will not be able to do that because they have 20 hours of work a day and other shit to do and kids to care and not anything where they actually gonna look into like these details. So why are we losing if we theoretically would have all these laws and took care of it? And I had actually a bit the first thought about this when I was in South Africa last summer to do holidays because I like the cold, so I went there because it was winter there. And then you realize, as you read before, that you have all these fences, and basically if you ask locals, they are like, yeah, because you cannot really be sure that the police ever shows up, so you have to go into self-defense. And that is not what we call a fully failed state, but a state that doesn't provide in certain areas where it should be provided. So by law, obviously, I don't know, robbing someone or killing someone is illegal in these countries as well. But is there actual enforcement? Is there actual consequences? And increasingly not so much. Doesn't mean it never happens, but it kind of happens less than expected. And if we now look back at digital law and digital rights in Europe, these guys would theoretically be our police force. That is the heads of the European data protection authorities. Each country has one, and theoretically they should get together and actually enforce all these laws that we already have and these fundamental rights. Now, we track all the cases we have, and we have about 800 and a little bit cases, and all of them are online, and every day at 3 o'clock in the morning, we update each case on everything that happened and all the timelines. This is the case results we have so far. So we're kind of lucky because the red bit is the ones we lost, so we usually win our cases, but the big problem is the gray part here. This part over there is all the cases that are pending for 3 years and longer. So fundamentally, you should usually get, for example, your right to access and a copy of your data within 1 month. In reality, you're sitting there for years and years and years to ever have anybody comply with these rules. Good example was YouTube. We filed a normal access request just to get a copy of your YouTube data. Not very surprising. 5.5 years to get a decision in the first instance. Theoretically, by the law, you should get it in a year. So basically, this data is not even the data that you have anymore. We now had a case against PimEyes. That's this platform where you could basically find people online through their kind of facial recognition. They say the technology is a bit different, but basically you can find pictures and find people again. And huge problem for people that want to hide somewhere that can be re-identified that way. We had this case in front of the Hamburg DPA. The Hamburg DPA, after 5+ years, sent us an outcome letter saying this is all illegal, but we're not going to take action because we don't think it's realistic to take action. You're like, why did you investigate something for 5 years to then come up to not do anything? With Facebook, as I mentioned before, we had a penalty of 1.2 billion euros, which was about data transfers to the US, because basically the NSA is in all these systems and can then, in the end, get that data pulled out. Everybody was celebrating this 1.2 billion, but none of that was ever paid so far. All of that is sitting in court systems and in regulators that are not doing much. If we look at the European-wide list, last time we did that was in 23. Of all these penalties that are out there, just our organization, being 25 people, triggered 39% of these penalties, if you take the total number. If you take the 1.5 billion out, because that was a big one, you're still at 19%. And there you can see how we have regulators that have thousands of employees actually not yielding much results versus an NGO that is rather small, donation funded, sitting in Vienna doing all these cases. And a part of the reason why a lot of the enforcement also doesn't yield any results is this one. We had a case against Meta where they basically got all the data from the Europeans without asking for consent. They just said it's necessary for the contract, so we just take all the data and run. This is roughly the, that's exactly the advertisement revenue they did in Europe, geographic Europe. So we have to take a little bit out because the UK is out and some other countries that are not EU countries. But you have probably a revenue that was made illegally in that time of somewhere in this gray area. We can't exactly put the pinpoint there because they don't publish these numbers. This is the maximum fine under the GDPR in comparison, 4% of the revenue. So basically, we usually said there are these billions of euros of fines and huge fines, and they sound very impressive. But if your revenue is that big, not so impressive. And interestingly, the European Data Protection Board then told the Irish regulator, who's in charge of Facebook, that they have to take into account these profits and at least go as far as possible in a penalty to kind of also cover the profits. The Irish then said, we're very sorry, but we cannot figure out the profits. This was public record. I got it on the train to my mom in like a minute on the phone. But the Irish regulator was unable to find out how much it is. Therefore, they ended up with this fine. And bottom line is, it just makes so much sense to violate all these laws, even if you get caught, even if there is the big fine in the end result is it just doesn't pay off. Now, what is the reason for that? This used to be the Irish regulator when I started. This here is a supermarket. This was the Irish regulator. And they regulated Facebook at the time, Microsoft, LinkedIn, Google, Twitter, basically the whole bunch of people. They're all regulated, they used to be all regulated in this place. Now, because we put this picture all over the international media, they got the fancy new office and more staff and all of this kind of things. But actual results, actual enforcement, we're right now at a quota in Ireland of about 99.9% of cases that get handled, which is what the law says, by just throwing them in a trash can. And the regulator says that is handling because it's not in front of us anymore, so therefore we handled the complaint. And that is where a lot of these rights that we theoretically have in reality go. Some of the ways that they do that is that the DPAs, the data protection authorities, in theory, are independent. So in theory, the executive only appoints them, but then they would be independent just like a judge is independent. In many countries, in reality, it's the same political party. They all know each other. Independence is not really the independence we think about. But what helps a lot is that the relevant justice minister, if you're asking the media, why is your regulator not doing anything, can say, oh, I'm terribly sorry, but the head is really independent. I can't order them to do more. So unfortunately, I can't tell them to do anything. So this actually works quite well as a shield for accountability as well. The legislative branch cannot do all too much. They can ask them into the parliament and so on. And for example, the Irish regulator was asked into the European Parliament, and she declined to come on the basis that I was asked as well, and she would only come if I would be disinvited by the parliament, whereby the parliament told her to F off. And end result is she never appeared, and therefore this legislative oversight never happened. Now, the judiciary is usually the place where you can go and say, I can sue that regulator if they don't do what they should do. Now, in Ireland, that costs at least 100,000 euros to go to court. So no normal person can ever go to court. We have this data transfer case that was mentioned before, like the Schrems 1 and 2, and I actually did have litigation with the Irish regulator twice, and we won twice, but the legal costs were 100 million euros for the second case. And I was personally liable for it. So I was like very happy that there is no enforcement agreement between Ireland and Austria, because I was like, worst case, I'm just gonna put my credit card in my shoe and that's it. But that is the reality if you actually go to judicial side. That's very different per country. In Austria, it costs 50 euros to go after the regulators. So you have from 50 euro to millions, loads of different options. And that's part of the reason why we do European strategic litigation, to go to the countries that are cheaper and more efficient. Now, the last option we had in countries like Ireland was to go out into the media and into the public. So we partly just published these documents, said, you know, they're not doing this, here's the details, and you're not going to get traction in the general public unless you can prove all these details. And that was probably our strongest sword in Ireland, or the strongest option we had. So they've now passed a law that makes it a crime to talk about pending procedures. If they declare them confidential. And they can declare almost any procedure confidential. And that is now the end result, where we cannot even really go out in the public with a lot of these cases, because we risk that my employees and myself are then looking at the criminal procedure in Ireland. And that overall basically isolated the regulator to not do anything and not really have any accountability. Now, theoretically, they could still sit in there and do their job and be good regulators. How do you prevent that? The new regulator in Ireland is one of the three, they now have three heads, is the former lobbyist of Meta. So the former lobbyist of Meta is now regulating privacy in Ireland for Meta, so to say. And then the question arises, what happened to the previous head, that's on the right? She now joined Meta's law firm. And interestingly, the law firm still litigates 20 of her own cases on behalf of Meta against her former self. So this is now kind of the way that we approach these. That happens in more countries too. There's also talks in Germany sometimes where it's extremely political who becomes the regulator. But for example, in the Netherlands, the former lawyer of TikTok became the regulator now. So we'll see how that develops. Again, this does not mean that person is not going to do a wonderful job, can well be, but the indication is kind of like weird if you were previously the big tech lawyer. Why do I talk about Ireland a lot? Basically, almost all these big tech companies are concentrated either in Ireland or in Luxembourg, mainly for tax reasons. So basically, these two countries became the loophole of the European Union. The law on paper exists, but is simply not enforced, and therefore you're operating in the European Union without really any consequence. Some are still in the Netherlands as well, especially cases that, like Netflix, that do a lot of IP because there is like tax benefits for that. But generally, we talk about these three countries if we talk about global tech companies. And they all basically do a game of risk. They basically just think, in this whole situation, not going to be a consequence, so let's take the data and run. What is going to happen? On the big picture, there is one issue that came up since the last couple of years, is that basically politics is afraid of this, is our growth rate. They basically say, oh, all these regulations, all of that is the reason why we don't grow. If we look globally, most people grow much less right now, but we still in each jurisdiction have terror right now. And the same thing in the US, where people think the world is going under, we need to do stuff. In Europe, we have that fear. Apparently in China, we have fears like that too. Everybody has the fear that we now need to deregulate, and it works really well. They just passed this digital simplification package where, for example, the GDPR is part of it with this omnibus law, as they call it. And the idea is to actually punch holes into the law that already is not really working all too much. So it could be interesting if Europe can uphold that standard, or if we actually roll back to a certain extent. And another element that is totally new is we used to have a rules-based order in some way, shape, or form. Now, imagine you're von der Leyen. I know that's a creepy feeling, but imagine you're that person and you have to now think about what are you doing in this situation. And you have, for example, Trump on the other side with all his tech bros. And you know if you issue the next fine, you're going to have the next endless drama over NATO, the endless drama about, I don't know, car fees, whatnot. What are you doing in this situation where it used to be that we're like, okay, that's our law, we just enforce it, but these rules have changed right now, and that may be another pressure point on maybe not looking all too much because you have all these consequences. Because it used to be that we were oftentimes on the same side with the US government. The Obama or the Biden administration were also thinking about regulating big tech to a certain extent. But now we have this situation where suddenly you have the biggest nation state in the world kind of partnering up with big tech, and suddenly they are more or less one thing. So what can we do for enforcement? How can we end on a somewhat positive note? And what is our plan to do something here? Now, first of all, we have to make sure that if we already got like the privacy thing up the hill, that it at least moves that direction and doesn't backslide. Right now, we have the problem that to a certain extent, some of these achievements we had the last 10 years are actually under a lot of pressure, and a lot of like backsliding could happen. The other thing that we need to do much more is to call out bullshit. I mean, basically, these things that I told you today are not publicized a lot, not called out a lot. Like there is some minor notice that now the former lobbyist is suddenly the regulator, but that is not something that probably got the attention it should get. And that could put some pressure on some of the regulators to rethink their position. They're under a lot of lobby pressure. On a personal level, I oftentimes understand their decisions because they talk 99% of the time to businesses that say, because of your enforcement, we're dying, and therefore there is this feeling of having to do something. In Germany, there was some of this. For example, when Kelber, the former head of the German DPA, got potentially removed, people even made like T-shirts with like Kelber Ultras, like football fans or something. So there is some of that, but it's tiny compared to the weight that these people actually have. And as I mentioned, if something like in Ireland happened, not much was actually done for enforcement. We go to the courts, we try to kind of push for the regulators, but that is what we can do on that side. What's really, I think, our beacon of hope is the European Union has also passed a collective redress directive, so basically class actions, which we typically did only have in the US and not in Europe. And that really allows that you're not this one guy, as I was, going against a big tech company. If that big tech company harms that one dude, basically, oftentimes you have like thousands of people that are harmed exactly the same way. And each person individually does usually not go to court. Why is that? Because you're burning money. If you think about the Dieselgate situation, this Volkswagen Dieselgate, basically the damages you got is about 4,000 euros for your car that is not worth as much because they manipulated the motor. The litigation was about 25,000. So you're basically never going to do that as an individual person. It's just insane financially. If you think about my data transfer cases, I basically had this up to 10 million in cost, as I mentioned before. I had a similar case where I got damages and 400 euros worth of damages awarded. So you have a 25,000-fold overpayment on the fees versus the actual enforcement that you have there. But in the privacy field, what's really interesting is we have thousands of people that have exactly the same problem, that were affected exactly the same way. And we're now thinking about doing more of these collective redress actions. The first one we do is kind of on the Austrian version of Schufa, like the credit ranking agency, because they got data basically of the whole country illegally, and that is quite interesting if they have to pay damages to everybody in the country. That suddenly makes that business model not that attractive. A lot of that is also on just wrong data or inaccurate data because they don't have very quality calculations. To give an example, we got the credit scoring from Didi Mataschitz, the owner of Red Bull. He was dead at the point, but he was still alive in the database. He had a credit ranking slightly below the Austrian average, even though he was the richest Austrian in that moment. So you see that a lot of that is also quite bullshit, and you can actually litigate on that. Mostly what they do is a little bit of age, and then the rest is geo-location. So if you move within the country, you suddenly have a score that goes up and down 150 points just because you change your location. It has nothing to do with your actual financials or any kind of background information they have. How did we do that? We basically got a class action app where people can sign up. In Austria, most of people have electronic ID, so they use that. We gave people other options as well, but 90% of the people just use EID. And the whole thing works in about 4 or 5 minutes on average to sign up. And what could be quite interesting is that we have this option on the one hand to do an injunctive case, which basically means the company cannot do it anymore. We can just sue them and say, don't do this business practice in the future anymore. And the second option we have is to have this redress case, which is kind of the typical class action where you get your damages. And you can basically then join people in. We're still the plaintiffs, so people do not have any risk themselves. The NGO that has to bring these cases has to risk. And we can then basically join them in the end when we think there is a very likely chance to win overall. What does that mean for big tech? Why could that be really interesting other than like Austrian credit ranking, which probably on a global scale is not too interesting or too important? This is roughly the chart on what I said before, the revenue that Meta made, where I showed you like the penalties being almost nothing. This is the damages that would create if you just put 500 euros per person. And then suddenly that changes the dynamic of what if that actually is a profit or a benefit to just violate people's rights. So that is our beacon of hope. I just count down to 0 seconds right now, so I was totally on point. And this is my end slide saying thank you, and I hope it was useful for you guys.